You're listening to the Packernet Podcast Network.
US Cellular has noticed the way we use our phones has gotten ironic. We try to put our phones down for dinner, but the menu's on a QR code. That's ironic. We hit like on social posts that we don't actually like, which is ironic. Which is why US Cellular created Us Mode, to help us reconnect with each other and use our phones less ironically. A phone company wanting people to use their phones less is ironic. Let's find us again with Us Mode from US Cellular. Visit uscellular.com/builtforus to get started.
You're a podcast listener, and this is a podcast ad. Reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a reproduced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com now. That's LIBSYN ads.com.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the It's Always Draft Season podcast, part of the Packernet Podcast Network. Jake Shavink here with you guys. Happy Monday, everybody. We've had a nice full week of preseason football, which is a lot of fun. But it's good to be back. Long time off. Obviously, college football coming up. We're going to, as far as future plans go, we're going to kind of get into the prospects here over the next month, really paint a good picture of essentially all of the position groups and really get ahead of ourselves. We'll have something later this week on that. I'm not going to spoil what position, but I think it could be one of importance for the Packers in 2025. But we're going to start with this. This is a little series I want to do before the season starts, and we're going to do this through maybe 5 draft classes. I still think there's a few that we can wait on, but I think maybe even 4. It just depends. We'll see. But going to go through some past draft classes, especially ones that I have covered and kind of gone through in depth, and just try to kind of look back with these and go through what I think will be fun is grading the grades of the 2017 draft and beyond. So we'll probably go to 2020 at least. Maybe we'll do 2021. That class has only been through 3 seasons to this point, so we'll kind of see how that goes, but we're starting in 2017, which, I think will be a fun way to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go over the class in depth at first, and then we're going to get into the grades. Who graded highly, who graded low. We're going to bring Consensus Big Board into this using NFL Mock Draft Database, and then kind of evaluate how things went for the graders at the end and kind of grade the grades that were instant, quick snap draft grades from 2017 NFL Draft Weekend. So let's start there with the 2017 NFL Draft class. And as a class as a whole, I think obvious strengths and weaknesses. We'll start with QB, right? If you don't remember, this was the Deshaun Watson, Mitchell Trubisky, Patrick Mahomes class. If you remember other names in that class, good for you. Cooper Rush maybe has come in and played for the Dallas Cowboys, but also notably the Taysom Hill draft. So that's something, of course, of note. Other quarterbacks who were in the consensus top 100, Deshaun Kaiser from Notre Dame, Davis Webb from Cal, and then Nathan Peterman from Pittsburgh. Joshua Dobbs has actually had some notable time, right, playing in Pittsburgh. Also, came in relief, signed by the Vikings and got them a win. The Pastronaut, as many called him after that. But other than that, not a whole lot. Obviously, we will be talking about the QBs based on the drafts and essentially how that turned out and how it was graded. Running back class was a deep one. It was a very, very deep class. You look at 3 running backs inside the consensus top 20, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, both of whom went top 10 in this draft. You had Dalvin Cook. Those were the 3 inside the top 20. It didn't stop there, though. You go down the list. 4th on the consensus board, Alvin Kamara at 43, Joe Mixon at 47. These aren't where they drafted. This is where they are on the big board. Samaje Perine has stuck around for a long time at 84. Deonta Foreman has suffered injury, but he's still stuck around in the league. He was 87th. Kareem Hunt was 99th on this. Marlon Mack, who played a lot of good games with the Colts, was 115th. Jamal Williams, everybody remembers him, of course, on this pod at 126. James Conner at 138. You're like, man, is he going to keep going? Yeah, I am. Tariq Cohen had some interesting years in Chicago at 175. Corey Clement obviously played meaningful snaps in the Super Bowl with the Eagles at 185. Aaron Jones at 186, of course. And then when you kind of go down a little bit further, Chris Carson, 336. If you don't remember him, 7th-round pick, Seattle Seahawks, played there for a few seasons, had a couple pretty solid seasons. And then at 406 on the consensus big board, undrafted, Austin Eckler from Western Colorado. So yeah, that was a mouthful. That's a impressive group at running back. Wide receiver, a little more forgettable. Cooper Kupp, the clear number one wide receiver in this class. It really isn't close after that. Corey Davis was obviously picked in the top 5, didn't really work. Mike Williams and John Ross were also top 10 picks in that draft. Curtis Samuel has done a nice job sticking around on different teams. He's been, kind of a good role player for a lot of teams. It'll be interesting to see how he does in Buffalo this year. Juju Smith-Schuster's had a really nice start to his career in Pittsburgh. Zay Jones was 64th on the consensus big board, had a big Senior Bowl week. Didn't really quite catch on. I know he's had some solid years in Jacksonville a little bit, but Chris Godwin at 83. So Kupp at 77 and Godwin at 83 on the consensus big board. Both have stuck with their teams to this point. Godwin maybe at the tail end of his career in Tampa Bay. We'll see where he goes after that. Not a lot after that. Josh Reynolds has played some good roles. Mac Hollins has stuck around in the league. Kenny Golladay got a big payday. Of course, Isaiah McKenzie weighed on at 243 on the big board. In Buffalo, found a role. Other than that, I know Kendrick Bourne's on here. I'm going to find him where his number is. Another Eastern Washington. So at 390 on the consensus big board. Zach Pascal from Old Dominion at 405. So there have been some role players. Not a lot of superstars, but there have been some role players in this one. Tight end's pretty good. O.J. Howard was the top tight end at number 8 on the consensus board. Just never really materialized for him. David Njoku at 20. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of time for him, but he figured it out. He's doing well in Cleveland. Evan Ingram was 46th on the consensus big board, the other first-round pick with Howard and Njoku in this draft. Again, had a really good rookie season. I believe had close to, if not more than 800 yards receiving as a rookie. Has obviously found a home in Jacksonville and has accumulated a lot of targets and receptions down there in his short stint to this point. Gerald Everett was 74th on the consensus big board. Bounced around a little bit. The Rams, Seattle, Chicago. So he's been around. George Kittle, obviously the headliner here at 111 on the consensus big board. Obviously one of the best in the league for a while. Jonnu Smith was 163rd on the big board. He's stuck around for quite a bit. After that, not a lot. O-line was a big struggle. Ryan Ramczyk is tops on the big consensus big board, 23rd overall. Obviously, injury has hurt, for him recently, but he's been, at the very least, in some seasons elite, in some seasons very good with the New Orleans Saints. Garrett Bowles got a second contract from the Broncos, was a first-round pick. He was 27th overall on the big board. Cam Robinson at 28. Jacksonville's hung on to him. Taylor Moton, 62nd, drafted by the Panthers, has stuck around and got a big second contract. After that, Jermaine Illuminor has bounced around, right? Connor McDermott kicked inside at least. But, man, it's not much after that. And then on the interior, there wasn't a lot. A lot of people liked Forrest Lamp, Pat Elflein, Ethan Posick. None of those really materialized at all. But the one that did, either listed as an interior offensive lineman, Deion Dawkins, has done really well in Buffalo. Very quality starting offensive tackle. When it comes to the D-line, and I'll group edge into here because they kind of did, but try to separate them as best I can here. Jonathan Allen, of course, very quality defensive tackle for a long time in Washington, 7th overall on the consensus big board. Solomon Thomas was third on the consensus big board. Colossal bust there. Dalvin Tomlinson was all the way down at 63. He's done well for himself, I believe, on 2 separate teams now. Giants and Cleveland Browns. Devon Gaucho for Miami and New England has played some decent rotational reps. But Grover Stewart for the Colts, who's been pretty underrated, 197 on the big board. DJ Jones has bounced around a lot of teams at 218. And then Al-Quadin Muhammad, who was a 7th-round pick at 257, has also bounced around, most notably with the Colts, but has done a decent job there. As far as edge goes, I want to see what they have listed at edge. Okay, yeah, this makes sense. So edge and defensive line, they're mixed on this, which stinks. But Myles Garrett and TJ Watt, of course, the headliners in this class, no doubt about it. Myles Garrett was at 1, TJ Watt a little further down in the late 20s on the consensus big board. Both are clearly cream of the crop there. As far as other notables, I mean, Derek Barnett, Taco Charlton, and Charles Harris were all first-round edge rushers. Didn't really pan out. Tack McKinley was also one of those guys. But as far as other guys who have stuck, Carl Lawson, really in Cincinnati, and then obviously signed a big deal, but he's dealt with some injury. He got a big second contract. Trey Hendrickson got a big second contract with the Cincinnati Bengals and has really been impactful with both the Saints and Bengals in his career. Samson Ebukam has bounced around. He's unfortunately just got injured with the Colts, which stinks, but not a super deep D-line and edge group. Linebacker was a bit of a struggle. When you look at the top guy on the consensus big board, Reuben Foster got into trouble with a lot more, as well as injuries. So, he ended up falling to the late first round, but he was 9th on the board. Hassan Reddick at linebacker has really converted to edge, basically 3-4 outside linebacker, and has done well, but was drafted to be a linebacker. It didn't quite work out. Zach Cunningham has bounced around a little bit. He's made some money there. Alex Anzalone at 97. Cunningham was 37 on the big board. Anthony Walker got a second contract at 136 on the big board. Other than that, I have to go further down. Matt Milano's the big one, right? 231 overall on the big board. Buffalo Bills has been a key cog in that defense. Corner was the other one, like running back, where you go, oh yeah, it was a loaded class. There were a lot of big names. Top 2 names on the consensus board, Marshawn Lattimore and Marlon Humphrey, have been great players, at least very good players. Tre'Davious White was pretty good for a while in Buffalo. He was 31st on the board. Chidobe Awuzie has done a lot more than a lot of guys ahead of him. He was 42nd overall. Desmond King, an impactful slot when he was at his peak at 56. Akella Witherspoon has hung around. Cam Sutton has hung around. Rasul Douglas, all were in the 90s on the consensus big board as well. And if you go a little bit further down, I think there's a couple more. Maybe there's not. No. But when you looked at the class as a whole, right, didn't mention Garyon Conley. Kevin King was a part of that. Quincy Wilson from Florida. Adoree Jackson had the return ability. Sidney Jones from Washington as well, like King. Tease Tabor from Florida, so Tabor and Wilson. Fabian Moreau had a lot of fans from UCLA. Jordan Lewis was a slot for Dallas for a while. So DeMonte Casey was a feisty nickel that a lot of people liked. So it was considered to be a loaded class. It has produced some pretty good results. And then when you look at safety, Jamal Adams was 5th on the board. Malik Hooker was 6th. Malik Hooker kind of faded out. Jamal Adams has mostly become a slot box type of safety. Budda Baker's the stud here, as is Marcus Williams. They were 40th and 55th on the consensus big board, respectively. Jabril Peppers has figured it out. It took a long time, a la David Njoku. He was 30th on the consensus board. Eddie Jackson was 102nd. It was kind of a short peak for him. And then another name that I think a lot of people would remember, Rudy Ford, 211 from Auburn. Wouldn't have been talked about a lot unless he had that big year with the Packers. Rayshawn Jenkins for the Chargers at 288 on the consensus board, and Chuck Clark has been bouncing around at 337 on the consensus big board. So yeah, obviously a lot of words there, but that was kind of painting the class as a whole. So let's start with this, right? So really nice, a little resource here. Rene Bounier has put together these on Twitter, which is really cool, where revisited the compilations of NFL team draft grades collected in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. 2017, there were only 13 evaluations that they compiled here. So, and this is instant draft grades for the complete draft. And what it did is it took all the evaluations, combined it into a GPA, and then ranked the GPA. Okay, if you guys want to see this, you want to find me at Jake NFL Draft on Twitter, I will send you the at least the link to this Twitter post, or I can message you it. But really nice painted picture, 1 through 32, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021, 2022. I'm sure they've put together the last two as well, but it's a really nice little resource that I used for this experiment here. And it's interesting. So let's go through. What we're going to do kind of and how we're going to kind of paint this picture is we're going to go through the top 10 in the GPA. And what we're going to do is what I wanted to find out was, was this linked at all to the basically how teams did versus the consensus board through like 4-ish rounds? Because once you get through 4 rounds, then you start, you reach for priority free agents potentially if you want them. If you have less picks, if you have more picks, you're going to kind of go after guys you like. It's going to skew it a little bit more. So I went through either 4 picks if you had your 4th pick was in the 5th round, or 4 rounds if the numbers were looking still like good or notable through 5 rounds. I included that because I thought it was interesting because there were some steals that kind of brought this, back more to 0 or up even higher or even lower. So that's kind of how I looked at this and looked at every class relative to the consensus board. The results were interesting, but let's go through this. I want to go through some notables first here, and what I'll do is we'll go, okay, this was the number 1 draft according to all the graders, and we're going to go through the class. So let's do this. The number 1 class, as graded by the evaluators in 2017, the Cleveland Browns. So if you don't remember the Cleveland Browns draft class, that is okay. We're going to go through it right now. They had 3 first-round picks, so that's notable, right? To kind of include okay, this may be why they were ranked so highly. They had high picks, and, they took players relatively around where they should have. It does kind of work. Myles Garrett, Jabril Peppers, and David Njoku were their 3 first-round picks. Deshaun Kaiser, the quarterback from Notre Dame, was their 2nd-round pick. They took Larry Ogunjobi, defensive tackle Charlotte, in the 3rd. If there are any other notables, not really. Howard Wilson in the 4th, corner from Houston. Roderick Johnson, O-line, Florida State, in the 5th. Caleb Brantley, who many may not remember, but those hardcore draft fans probably do know who Caleb Brantley was. Very, very talented. Had some off-field stuff come up, then didn't test well at the combine. Fell from projected 1st to 2nd-round pick all the way to the 6th. Took kicker Zane Gonzalez in the 7th and running back Matthew Days in the 7th. So when you look at that class overall, you might be like, kind of after the first 3, there's not much there at all. And I would agree. Garrett and Njoku have both stuck around and been quality players. Ogunjobi was solid in the rotation for a while. And then Jabril Peppers has clearly found a home in New England and is playing at a high level. So do you credit them for that? Maybe not. But there you go. So New England Patriots were the 2nd-ranked draft class in terms of GPA. They only had 4 picks, so this was interesting. What we'll do is I'll go through the top 10, then we'll kind of go through relative to consensus, how they looked right in terms of plus minus versus that consensus big board, and we're going to go through a lot more notables. Bear with me. It took a lot of time to figure out how I'm going to go with this, but I'm almost kind of winging it a little bit in terms of the order here. But New England Patriots, 2 picks in the 3rd round, 1 pick in the 4th, 1 pick in the 6th, okay? 3rd-round pick Derek Rivers, defensive end, Youngstown State. 3rd-round pick Antonio Garcia, offensive lineman from Troy. 4th-round pick Dietrich Wise, D-line, Arkansas. And then 6th-round Connor McDermott, listed as a tackle from UCLA, obviously has kicked inside since then. And has bounced around. That was the number 2 class, as graded by the evaluators. Number 3, okay? San Francisco 49ers. All right, here's the class of the San Francisco 49ers. Solomon Thomas, Reuben Foster were their 2 first-round picks at 3rd and 31st. Took Ahkello Witherspoon in the 3rd round, corner from Colorado. C.J. Beathard, 104th pick in the 3rd round. 104th overall, 3rd round, quarterback from Iowa. Running back Joe Williams from Utah, 121st overall, 4th round. They got George Kittle in the 5th. Trent Taylor, wide receiver, Louisiana Tech in the 5th. DJ Jones, defensive tackle in the 6th. Pita Ta'amoepeinu, defensive end, Utah. And then Adrian Colbert, cornerback, Miami in the 6th and 7th round. Doesn't sound very good overall there, besides George Kittle and if you count Witherspoon bouncing around. So, yeah, that was number 3. Really, really solid. Washington Commanders are your number 4 draft in terms of the grades, in terms of the GPA, I should say. Washington's draft. They got Jonathan Allen at 17 overall in the 1st round. Brian Anderson, edge rusher, Alabama as well in the 2nd. Fabian Moreau, corner from UCLA in the 3rd. Samaje Perine, running back, Oklahoma in the 4th. Monte Nicholson, safety, Michigan State. If you don't remember him, he ran really fast. Jeremy Sprinkle, tight end, Arkansas in the 5th. Chase Rouillet, center, Wyoming in the 6th. Robert Davis, wide receiver, Georgia State in the 6th. 7th round picks were Josh Harvey Clemens, safety, Louisville, and Joshua Holsey, safety, Auburn. Okay. 5th overall, the Los Angeles Chargers in terms of GPA. Their draft, Mike Williams at 7. Forrest Lamp in the 2nd round. Dan Feeney in the 3rd round. Rayshawn Jenkins in the 4th. Desmond King in the 5th. Sam Tevy in the 6th. Isaac Rochelle in the 7th. Buffalo Bills were 6 in terms of GPA. The Buffalo Bills draft, Tre'Davious White in the 1st round, Zay Jones, and Deion Dawkins in the 2nd round. Matt Milano in the 5th round. Nathan Peterman in the 5th round. Tanner Vallejo in the 6th round. Indianapolis Colts were the 7th ranked draft in terms of GPA. Overall GPA, their draft, Malik Hooker in the 1st round, Quincy Wilson in the 2nd, Terrell Basham in the 3rd, Zach Banner, Marlon Mack, and Grover Stewart in the 4th, Nate Hairston and Anthony Walker in the 5th. The 8th ranked draft in terms of overall GPA in the 2017 NFL draft, the Houston Texans. Deshaun Watson in the 1st, Zach Cunningham in the 2nd, Deonta Foreman in the 3rd, Julian Davenport in the 4th, Carlos Watkins in the 4th, Tristan DeCoud in the 5th, Kyle Fuller, center from Baylor, not Kyle Fuller, cornerback, Virginia Tech, in the 7th. The number 9 draft, okay, the Green Bay Packers. In terms of overall GPA, Kevin King in the 2nd, Josh Jones in the 2nd, Montravius Adams in the 3rd, Vince Beagle and Jamal Williams in the 4th, D'Angelo Yancey and Aaron Jones in the 5th, Kofi Amichia in the 6th, Devontae Mays and Malachi Dupree in the 7th. There was actually a tie in terms of GPA for the 9th spot in this draft class. The other team, T9, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, O.J. Howard in the 1st, Justin Evans in the 2nd, Chris Godwin in the 3rd, Kendall Beckwith in the 3rd, Jeremy McNichols in the 5th, and Steve Tuikolovatu in the 7th. So there you go. Your top 10 drafts are of GPA. Does that sound good? Is everyone still there? Are we on the same page? Now, what I want to do with the top 10 is go, okay, so what I did is painstakingly went to the consensus big board, obviously, ranked, put all those numbers next to where they were selected in my Google Doc here, and found some notables, of course, in terms of either, okay, through three-ish through 4 picks, 4 rounds, or notably 5 rounds, if it was that good. I marked you down on one side of this notebook here. It was like, okay, how do they look relative to what the top 10 teams looked like? Would it be a similar list? Would it be a very different list? Turns out it's a very different list. So the grades themselves, at least from what I'm seeing here, which I think is notable, is that there is, versus the GPA versus just how do they do against the consensus big board, Very little correlation here. But that's a little teaser. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back here and really break all of this down.
US Cellular has noticed the way we use our phones has gotten ironic. We try to put our phones down for dinner, but the menu's on a QR code. That's ironic. We hit like on social posts that we don't actually like, which is ironic. Which is why US Cellular created Us Mode, to help us reconnect with each other and use our phones less ironically. A phone company wanting people to use their phones less is ironic. Let's find us again with Us Mode from US Cellular. Visit uscellular.com/built-for-us to get started.
This episode is brought to you by our good friends at NFL Sunday Ticket on YouTube TV. I'm sure by now you've all gotten back into your Sunday routines, but they could be even better. With NFL Sunday Ticket and YouTube TV, you get the most live NFL games all in one place, every game, every Sunday, and you can even watch up to 4 different games at once with Multiview, one of my favorite inventions of this decade. It's exactly what you need to catch all the action, make your Sundays more magical, and also YouTube TV is great. I got it this year. It's awesome. Sign up now at youtube.com/BS. Device and content restrictions apply. Local and national games on YouTube TV. NFL Sunday Ticket for out-of-market games excludes digital-only games.
You're a podcast listener, and this is a podcast ad. Reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a reproduced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com now. That's LIBSYN ads.com. You're a podcast listener, and this is a podcast ad. Reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a reproduced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com now. That's LIBSYN ads.com.
All right, guys, so we're back here on It's Always Draft Season. Had to take the break. Didn't realize I was almost 25 minutes-ish in here. But that's, that's what happens when I start rambling about the draft. So, as I was saying, going through those top 10 draft classes and then looking at notables versus the consensus big board. Now, I will say, okay, the number one team, right, in terms of how you did versus the consensus big board through a certain number of rounds, right? We talked about this 4 picks or 4 rounds. The top team was, believe it or not, and again, this is going to change. And I'm double checking my work now because I'm like, okay, did I mess up anywhere? Okay, so the top 2 teams, funny enough, New England was plus 55 versus the consensus big board, meaning they got players, which is all of their picks, all 4 of their picks. They were credited with either what we call this 55 picks worth of steals in the draft. The Cleveland Browns were second in terms of a plus 53 differential versus the consensus board and where they were selected. So the top 2 got the top 2 spots. And you go, okay, well, wait a minute, Jake. Sounds like the correlation is working. It's not, because the when you look at these, right, there are some massive reaches that happen. And it's hard to, kind of put this all together when, teams have their 4th pick in the 5th round versus their 4th pick in the 2nd round. It's kind of hard to do. So the Cleveland Browns were plus 53 through 5 rounds of their draft. New England obviously only had a 3rd, 4th, and 6th, but were plus 55. Okay. Number 3 on the list, the San Francisco 49ers, right? We talked about them, 3rd ranked draft class, okay? So, through 4 rounds, I kid you not, through 4 rounds, right? This, to be fair, this is without Kittle, right? And we can go down, but it doesn't change too much after that. It actually gets even worse. Okay, once you get all the way down. But we can kind of talk about this because this is an important one. Through 4 rounds, the San Francisco 49ers were a minus 375 versus the consensus big board, okay? So through 3 picks, funny enough, okay, it wasn't that bad. Okay, it was 24, 22. Yeah, so they were +2. Or no, they were -2. -2 versus the consensus big board through 3 selections, right? But that was only the first pick in the third round for them. Beathard was 146 picks to the negative in terms of the consensus board. Niners took him at 104. Consensus big board had him at 250. Joe Williams was picked 121st. Consensus big board had him at 348. Okay, so they're -375 through the fourth round. Kittle got them about 35 in the positive, so that would get them to 340. Trent Taylor takes it back up to 350, was -10. DJ Jones is minus another 20, so they're back up to where they almost were already through the sixth round. And then their last 2 picks were over 100 in the red, in the negative. So they would have been in the, closing in on 600, right? -600 net against the consensus big board. But we're still ranked as the 3rd overall class in terms of GPA. So that obviously massively skews it, right? But if you look at some teams who were, at least for me, hovering around even through that 5th round, 4th pick-ish area, here are the teams you get, okay? Carolina, who we have not mentioned. Cincinnati, we have not mentioned. Dallas, we have not mentioned. New Orleans, we have not mentioned. Oh, but we will. And the Jets, who we have not mentioned. Now, there were some other teams who were notable, okay? Those 2 teams, Green Bay +9 through 4 rounds. They were the 9th overall draft class in terms of GPA. Houston was +12 in the net relative. Houston was +12 relative to the consensus big board. They were ranked 8, okay? Tampa Bay, funny enough, ended up overall +37. Okay, that's through all of their picks. So they had 6 picks, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 7th, but they were -19 through the 3rd round, right? And 4 of the 6 picks were 3rd round or higher for them. So -19, that's not bad. That's around the number, okay? So we've kind of gone over this because I'm throwing a lot of numbers out at you guys, and I know it's a lot, it's confusing. But if we go down the top 10, right, Cleveland's +53 relative to the consensus big board. New England's +55. We talked about San Francisco -375. Through their overall draft, they're pushing -600. Washington, the Commanders, were -115 through the 4th round, okay, relative to the consensus big board. The Chargers were -48 through 5 rounds. The Bills were -22 through 5 rounds. And then Indy, right, who we ranked 7th, was -14 through 4 rounds. And Indy, funny enough, as you look at their draft through those 4 rounds, right, you see pretty good numbers. Anthony Walker was he was +25 in terms of value in the 5th. Hairston was the -120, so they would have ended up decently in the red. But an overall Ballard draft got some steals, but they end up -14. We talked about Houston in the 8th spot at +12, Green Bay +9 in the 9th spot, and Tampa Bay was +37 overall, -19 through the notable 3 rounds. So you could tell me, other than the big one, San Francisco and maybe Washington, it seems like everybody stayed relatively close to the consensus big board. And I think that's fair. But here's what I will say. Right, and you can go, well, the numbers get progressively worse, right, as you go all the way down. Not really. It's pretty scattershot, okay? So when you look at this, so some of the notables, right, that we kind of talked about who hovered around that, almost net zero, right, through 4-ish, 5-ish rounds relative to the consensus board. We talked about Carolina, right? They were -6 through 5 rounds of the draft. Their draft class, in terms of GPA, was 18th. Cincinnati was +8 through 4 rounds. They were ranked 23rd. Dallas was -1. They were ranked 17th. New Orleans -8. They were ranked 24th. The Jets were +5 relative to the consensus big board. They were ranked 26th. So there's still in the teens and the misses, right? Pittsburgh, who's a notable draft that we'll talk about, was minus 41. They were 19th in terms of GPA. We talked about New Orleans at minus 8, 24 spot. Kansas City was minus 105 relative to the big board. Their draft class ranked 27th in GPA. The Rams were 31st. They were minus 146 through 4 rounds relative to the consensus board. There are some bad ones, right? Arizona minus 204 through 4 rounds. Now, that was heavily carried by their selection of Chad Williams at pick 98, who was ranked 335th on the consensus big board. I'd say the consensus big board won in that regard, but Arizona was ranked 16th in terms of GPA. Miami was ranked 15th in terms of GPA. And it turns out Miami, and I messed this up. I knew I messed this up. But when I said Cleveland and New England were 1 and 2, they were actually 2 and 3. Miami, through 5 rounds, which is 5 picks of their 7, were plus 125 versus the consensus big board. Plus 125. That is the top ranked one right there through the criteria that we did. Draft class, GPA, 15th. Seattle was minus 190 through 5 rounds. They were ranked 21st. Some other notables, of course, the New York Giants ranked 28th. They were minus 167. Denver ranked 25th, minus 143. Or no, that's Detroit. Sorry. Hold on. Messed that up. We'll backtrack for a second. The New York Giants were minus 35 and were ranked 28th. Denver was minus 167, ranked 25th. Detroit was ranked 30th, minus 143. Las Vegas ranked 29th, minus 117. And Chicago, who on this list was ranked 32nd in terms of GPA at a 133 GPA overall, was only minus 97 versus the consensus big board through 4 rounds. Okay. So it's very scattershot. All of this is all over the place, right? But obviously, you'd rather hear about, the top grades 5 years, 6 years down the road, right? That's what we're here to see, of course. And we can go through all the grades kind of and look at how things turned out. First off, we didn't talk about this team. They were ranked 4th in terms of the net value versus the consensus big board after Miami, after New England, after Cleveland. It is the Baltimore Ravens plus 41 through 5 rounds. That is 6 of their 7 selections. Okay, Baltimore, in that spot, their draft class was ranked 12th. So it just seems like, in terms of what these grades are, right, relative to the consensus board, it's not playing that much of a factor. So it's more relative, I think, to how either and some of these, if you go individual by individual, right, I assume what you're going to find is you're going to find somebody who definitely graded versus the consensus board. I'm sure someone did, but it's clear that not everybody did. Because if everybody did, the Niners would be in as far into last as possible, right? So obviously not always versus the consensus big board is how teams grade, but how, the process is getting quarterback, attacking positions that are valuable, right? All of these things, of course, I think matter to a degree in terms of how they are graded, right after the draft. It's like, okay, well, this was good process. You had players you needed here, so you took players of need, but also at value. You did a good job mixing those. Some teams will be like, yeah, you just took value after value after value. Some teams, you took the QB, good job, right? We talked about the Browns. You had 3 first-round picks, good job with those. New England, you didn't have a lot of resources. You did what you could with those resources, good job. So there's a lot of different things that obviously went through this. But let's talk about the results, okay? So we kind of went through the classes, right, that were of note, the top 10. I think I would say that Green Bay was not a top 10 class, I think. Wouldn't you agree? Cleveland's tougher, right? So I went to Bleacher Report because someone did grades in 2022, which, kind of saves, a couple things. I think there's been a couple later breakouts so that, they could have altered these a little bit if you look in 2024 now versus 2022. But Cleveland got a B, and clearly they were in the 3.5 range, so they were getting A's and they were getting B pluses, of course. So there was a lot of that for sure. In that 3.5, I guess 3.5 is, 3.5 would be a sort of B plus ish number, right? So there was 3.57, so just ahead of a B plus overall. But they obviously got a lot of them. They finished with a B 5 years later, and I think that B is a fair grade, because when you look at how good Garrett has been, how good Njoku has finally become, how good Peppers is just on another team, you go, okay, the first round picks, they look good, and it's kind of a crapshoot from there. You didn't take the quarterback, but you took a quarterback, which a lot of teams it's just going to be valued no matter what, like a good process. Taking someone on day 2, maybe he'll threaten for the starting job, and maybe he'll do something. So I think Cleveland did fine. We talked about New England, right? This is not good at all. This is 4 picks. Their 2022 letter grade was a D from Bleacher Report. Obviously, Derek Rivers and Antonio Garcia, you probably don't know who those guys are unless you're a draft diehard. You probably don't know who those guys are. You maybe barely know who Dietrich Wise and Connor McDermott are. The Patriots were handed a D, and basically in the article itself said Dietrich Wise, who has at least done a little bit with the team, saved this team from an F. Those were the words in there, which is fair enough. The San Francisco 49ers got a C+. Obviously, Kittle has been impactful. Beathard and Joe Williams, yikes. Foster and Thomas, yikes. Akella Witherspoon, I'm not sure how it's a C+. I guess Kittle is just dragging this thing as far as he can possibly go, which good for them, but they squandered a lot of draft capital in this class, and that C+, I feel like, is even a little bit generous for them. Now, Washington, they were handed a B. I know Rouillet played quite a bit. Obviously, Pirine has stuck around. Moreau is still in the league. I'm not sure how it's a B. I know Allen's has had elite years and very good years. I don't know if it's still a B. It's hard because you have to you could curve grade this. There were a lot of teams that were handed Bs. 8. So under half the league got A's and Bs in this. So, excuse me, I guess the curve's not bad. But Washington got a B for that. Okay, as far as the Chargers go, their letter grade, I believe it should have been a B. Yeah, another team that got a B. And when you look at it, Mike Williams hung around for a while. Rayshon Jenkins, Desmond King did as well. Obviously, Feeney and Lamp didn't do a whole lot, but it's hard to fault the O-line process with those guys, so they get handed a B. Funny how we haven't said any A's yet, and there are 5 A's in this class. Now, we're going to get to one of them, and I agree with it, in the 6th spot, Buffalo Bills. Right, who of the top 6 were 3rd in terms of how they did versus the consensus big board. And the real big outlier in terms of reach was actually Matt Milano, funny enough. So it's funny how that turns out. Trey White, Deion Dawkins, Matt Milano, 3 of their 6 selections. That's going to get you an A. Period. There's no argument against it. Okay, so they do a good job there. They are the first A. Spoiler alert, they are the only A in the top 10. Okay? Indianapolis Colts, right? We talked about them. They were minus 14. Ballard stayed relatively close to the consensus board. Malik Hooker and Quincy Wilson, they got a C+ in the regrading process. Anthony Walker, Grover Stewart are the impact players. Other than that, Nate Hairston didn't do much. Marlon Mack did some things, as a depth, spot starting running back. Zach Banner didn't do a whole lot. Terrell Basham. Malik Hooker, you could argue, played better once he went to Dallas after he left Indy, and Quincy Wilson didn't amount to anything. So a C+, for Stewart and Walker, I guess, as being good picks on day 3, salvages the class. Houston Texans, obviously, The big ones here are the first three for them. It's Watson, of course. It's Zach Cunningham, and it's Deonta Foreman. They traded Watson, right? Watson got into trouble. They got a C, which I think is fair considering all the Watson issues. They didn't win a lot of big games in the playoffs. Cunningham is still around. Foreman's still around, but not that great. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 7 in terms of picks, but again, a team that just didn't really get it. Again, Green Bay, we talked about them, +9, right, relative to the consensus board in the T9 slot, gets a C-. And really, Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams are carrying this thing, and there's not much else there, right? King, Jones, Montravius Adams, Vince Beagle are their first 4 picks. Nothing there. 2 wide receiver picks who did nothing. 1 pick on the offensive line in Kofi Amichia. Not deserving of a top 10 spot. And we talked about Tampa Bay, right? We talked about them. They got a C. O.J. Howard didn't amount to much. Justin Evans, no. Chris Godwin's your top player in this class. Kendall Beckwith, Jeremy McNichols, and Steve Tui Kolovatu, nothing much there. Do not deserve a top 10 spot. Now, in my opinion, I think the top 5 classes are very clear. I think Buffalo is among them. But the top 2 classes are even clearer considering what they did. Okay? You can call it number 1 or number 2. I'm going to go with number 1 being the class that I think is the best. They didn't get the QB like the other team, but they got a tremendous draft overall. You know all of these players. None of these players are not playing anymore. Maybe Al-Quadin Muhammad is not playing anymore, but he has taken impact snaps, maybe not for the Saints, but for the Colts in some capacity. But their draft, the New Orleans Saints were ranked in the GPA, overall GPA in the class, 24th with a 2.82. Okay? So that is a B- in GPA. Okay? I should know the GPA stuff, but I'm just looking at it. But they're ranked 24th in overall GPA in this draft in terms of quick snap draft grades. They landed Marshawn Lattimore and Ryan Ramczyk in the first round. So I'm not sure what the deal is. Multiple first-round picks. Cleveland had multiple first-round picks. They lauded it. They really loved Cleveland draft. They didn't like New Orleans. New Orleans took Marcus Williams. I know he went to Baltimore, but he's an impact safety. They took him in the second round. They took Alvin Kamara and Alex Anzalone, Kamara has delivered big time for them, was huge for them from jump, even carried the team at times when Breeze was hurt in Bridgewater. And Anzalone, maybe more of an impact player in Detroit than he was with New Orleans, but still a guy who stuck around and who is still playing. Trey Hendrickson, good player in New Orleans, really good player in Cincinnati. And then we mentioned Al-Quadin Muhammad, who I don't think made the team, but then, found a home with Indy. This draft, top to bottom, is phenomenal. They got an A, of course. They should have got an A+, in my opinion. I think this is one of the best drafts we've ever seen in terms of value, impact, plenty of premium positions as well in this mix, and players who have gotten all pros. Just incredible draft for them. They were ranked 24th, as I said, in GPA. They were -8 through 3 rounds, and I thought it was fair to include 3 rounds because they had 6 picks in the first 3 rounds. So again, another team that had a lot of draft capital and used it and were not rewarded in the grading. But relative to the consensus big board, they were just -8 in terms of value versus the consensus big board. Al-Quadin Muhammad was the really only reach. 196 was the pick they took him at. He was ranked 257th on the board. Splitting hairs. And then, of course, the number 2 draft class, ranked 27th in GPA with a 2.69, the Kansas City Chiefs. Still in that B-ish range for some in the U.S. It's typically 77 to 79%. That's a C+. Kansas City, it truthfully doesn't matter about Tano Passignon, Jehu Chesson, Ukeme Eligwe, Leon McCoy III. No. It's about they moved up 17 spots and they took Patrick Mahomes, who many described as a reach with a lot of ceiling potential, but there was raw tools there that they had to develop. It took 1 year of sitting in development, really 17 weeks, and he burst onto the scene with a great game against the Broncos to play in the final game of that Chiefs season. Got to play in his rookie season and then has lit the league on fire, won MVPs, won 3 Super Bowls since then. Tremendous player. Kareem Hunt was a really, really good player in Kansas City. Yes, he got into trouble. Not great, not a great person, but made a serious impact in Kansas City from jump, like Alvin Kamara did with the Saints. Obviously, it made an impact in Cleveland as well. Yes, it's a 2-player class, but that player is one of those 2 players is Patrick Mahomes. That's carrying your class. They would well deserve the A. We talked about Buffalo. They were 6th in GPA. They were pretty solid relative to the consensus board with a minus 22 through 5 rounds. Right, the Chiefs were a minus 105. We mentioned them. And New Orleans was minus 8. So, didn't stray too far from consensus board. Those are 3 of your top 5. The other 2 that received A's. First of those, in alphabetical order, the Los Angeles Rams, who were minus 146 through 4 rounds versus the consensus board. That would have been 5 of their 8 selections, but let's go through those selections, shall we? Gerald Everett in the 2nd round, Cooper Kupp in the 3rd, John Johnson in the 3rd, Josh Reynolds and Samson Ebukam in the 4th. Those 5 players have all played significant snaps with that team. Ebukam has been a good rotational rusher. We mentioned him already, got hurt. He was in Indy for training camp. Reynolds was a quality, depth receiver, number 3-ish receiver. Cooper Kupp is Cooper Kupp. John Johnson was a good safety in LA, went to the Browns after that, and then Everett has bounced around, but he's still in the league. All those 5 contributed to a kind of resurgence at the start of the Sean McVay era. They got an A-. I would say they're not as good as the other team that got an A, but relative to what we've seen elsewhere, it was a pretty good draft for them. Remember, minus 146 relative to the consensus big board. The Rams were ranked in terms of GPA 31st overall in the cumulative GPA draft grades. Okay. Not to mention that's a C- as a 1.92 GPA. So, they only beat the Chicago Bears, who got a 1.33. Not great. Chicago's draft wasn't great. They got that right. The other team got a 2.98 GPA, ranked 19th in terms of overall GPA for the class, was minus 41 versus the consensus big board. That is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay? Pittsburgh Steelers. First round, TJ Watt at 30th overall. Second round, Juju Smith-Schuster, who had his best seasons with the Steelers. Might have even had a 1,500-yard season. Contributed to one of the Chiefs' rings as their, quick game middle field guy with some yak toughness. Cam Sutton has been in Pittsburgh on 2 instances, was in Detroit. Quality nickel corner. James Conner, impact running back for Pittsburgh, impact running back for Arizona. Josh Dobbs, again, not the greatest quarterback, but did enough to earn some much-needed wins for teams in desperation mode. So those are your 5 A's. Right, we talked about where they ranked overall in terms of GPA. The Buffalo Bills were 6th. Kansas City was 27th. New Orleans was 24th. Pittsburgh 19th. And the Rams 31st. Okay. Teams who graded poorly and the draft ended up poorly. We kind of mentioned quite a few of them. Let's start alphabetically. Denver was ranked 25th. They were minus 167 through 3 rounds versus the consensus board. Other than Garrett Bowles, it's a train wreck. And they had 8 selections. DeMarcus Walker, Carlos Henderson, Brendan Langley, Jake Butt, Isaiah McKenzie, D'Angelo Henderson, Chad Kelly. Stop me if you've heard a name. If you heard Isaiah McKenzie, yes, you are, a football junkie, played with Buffalo. Other than that, not great. Detroit was ranked 30th. They were minus 143 relative to the consensus board through 4 rounds. Gerard Davis, Tease Tabor, Kenny Galladay, Jalen Reeves-Maben, Michael Roberts, Jamal Agnew, Jeremiah Ledbetter, Brad Kaiaya, and Pat O'Connor. Nice. Denver got a D+ in the regrade, by the way. The Detroit Lions got a C. Okay. Who else did poorly and graded poorly? The Las Vegas Raiders. Really, really good. So this was back even when they were Oakland, actually, in this draft class. But minus 117 relative to the consensus board. They ranked 29th in overall GPA. Garyon Conley, Obi Melifonwu, Eddie Vanderdoes, David Sharp, Markel Lee, Shalom Luani, Jylan Ware, Elijah Hood, Trayvon Hester. Yikes. Only team who got an F. Only team who got an F. Now, funny enough, Miami, who did well against the consensus board, got a D- because Charles Harris, Raekwon McMillan, Cordrea Tankersley, Isaac Asiata, Devon Gaucho, Vincent Taylor, and Isaiah Ford. That's not very good. That will not get you any points. You are only surpassed by the Vegas Raiders in terms of futility in that draft. So, again, I think we mentioned this team, and I didn't go through their draft class, but I think it's important to kind of talk about it. There were 8 teams who got in the Bs. We talked about Cleveland. We talked about the Chargers. We talked about Washington, right, who got Bs. Arizona got a B-. Let's talk about them really quick. Hassan Reddick, who they drafted in the first to be a linebacker. Arizona, the previous regime, had trouble figuring out where hybrid defensive players would end up playing. Reddick has found a home as an edge rusher. Philly and now the Jets. And they got Budda Baker, who's a stud at safety. They didn't do really well after that, but they got a B- because of those 2 guys. And, of course, Rudy Ford, who had a little bit of resurgence as well in Green Bay for a season there. So they got one of the Bs. They were ranked 16th in GPA. We talked about minus 204 to the big board from there. The next team who got in the Bs, Baltimore got a B+. Remember, we talked about them. They were plus 41 versus the big board through 5 rounds. When you look at their draft, you might not recognize a lot of it at first, which is fair. When it comes to Tim Williams, who was regarded as a major steal versus the consensus board, and then Nico Siragusa, offensive lineman from San Diego State, who was relatively neutral, just a minus 12 versus the board. You find still pretty good outside of that. Marlon Humphrey has been very good for them as their corner 1. Tyus Bowser actually got significant reps with them in his time there. Chris Wormley, before he was traded to Pittsburgh, was a big part of that rotation on the defensive line. Jermaine Illuminor, as we've mentioned, has hung around the league for a long time, as has Chuck Clark. So, again, not the best draft, but nowhere near the worst. Plenty of players still in the league. They got a B+. They were the only team to get a B+. Baltimore's rank in GPA, we talked about this, was 12th. They end up 6th in the regrade. Okay. The other Bs, just quickly going through this, Carolina, Christian McCaffrey, Curtis Samuel, and Taylor Moton are carrying that heavily, as they should be, right? All 3 are still in the league. Samuel is a little bit underrated in terms of his value. McCaffrey is still excellent, and Moton has really only been the Panthers' quality offense, the only offensive lineman of quality for the Panthers for a while. They did draft Harrison Butker in the 7th, funny enough. So Carolina gets a B there. Their GPA got them 18th overall in the draft class. We talked about them briefly. They were minus 6 versus the consensus big board through 5 rounds. So Baltimore would have been 6th. You could split hairs over Cleveland, Carolina, the Chargers, and Washington for the top 10. So when you look at that top 10, Washington, the Chargers, Cleveland, right? Washington, the Chargers, and Cleveland 3 of them. So 4 of the top 10 stayed in the top 10 in terms of the regrade. So not bad. 4 out of 10. Would obviously like to do better. But, again, the draft is heavily a crapshoot. And, that's how that goes. The other teams who got Bs, right, we kind of mentioned most of them through this point. We already talked about Cleveland, right? Jacksonville we didn't really talk about. They're in the B- range, so they would be, let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they're in the top 13. I would prop them in Arizona for that 13th spot or 12th spot. Leonard Fournette and Cam Robinson heavily carrying that group. So just 2 players. And then we're going to go to the last one, the New York Giants, who had Ingram and Dalvin Tomlinson, so 2 players as well. If you want to go to the C+, we kind of talked about a couple of them, right, whether you knew it or not. San Francisco, you want to call Kittle, who's probably the only one more than the others. You could, I guess. But I think they should be left for sure out of the top 10. As far as other C+, the Vikings got a C+. When you look at it, it's Dalvin Cook and no one else legitimately. It was just not good for them. So that's the other C+ there. Indianapolis got a C+. We kind of talked about it. Stewart and Anthony Walker. You could split hairs on that versus Kittle and Dalvin Cook as well. So again, and Dallas was the other C+ that should be mentioned. Chidobe Awuzie, Jordan Lewis still sticking around. Xavier Woods is still playing. Noah Brown helped them out. So there was a lot of role play there for them. So again, I think this was a good exercise in just kind of looking at, again, I threw a lot of names, a lot of numbers at you. Hopefully you kind of were able to make sense of it a little bit. I'm hoping so. But yeah, and so to kind of grade this as a whole, I mean, to leave Kansas City and New Orleans outside of the top 20 is massive oversight. The Rams at 31 is a massive oversight. Did still get 4 of the 10 in the top 10, which isn't bad. But I think it shows you that the instant draft grades, whatever the formula is, and we're going to keep going through to find the formula if something forms, is not just, it's never going to always work out perfectly. And I've already been through some of 2018 and 19 as we keep the series going. It gets interesting for sure. But it's very clear that the GPA didn't exclusively come from relative to consensus board. It didn't obviously exclusively come from relative to individual rankings, process, and, opportunity cost. All of these things could definitely come into play when talking about the draft. That's what makes it endlessly complex and extremely fun, because we can do all the work we possibly can and we still don't know. So hope you guys enjoyed this episode. It's good to be back on the It's Always Draft Season pod. We're going to keep going, as I said, with these at least until 2020. We'll see. Maybe you guys want to hear 2021 already. Maybe we'll save that until after this 4th season for that class. Maybe that's a good time to revisit. But at the very least, we're going to do the first 4, as I mentioned, 17, 18, 19, and 20. After that, of course, already mentioned, positional previews for 25. Get some early looks there. We'll be definitely doing that. And we'll see during the season if there's something you guys want to hear. Rookie reports, young player reports, how things are looking in that regard. First, second, third-year players, just Packers. We'll kind of figure that out along the way. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Pack Go. And, of course, it is always